those of you who are here. Thank you, Sona. A special applause from Sona, I appreciate that. That's very good. Well, it is lovely to be back here, I must admit, and to have another chance to engage in some of these really challenging and difficult issues. Nice to see some old friends, nice to meet some new people. I rather enjoyed some of the lively debates yesterday and some of the emerging disagreements, which were quite good fun. I rather enjoyed the moment where Richard Branson described Jeremy Leggett as a romantic. This is not a light in which I've seen Jeremy before, but that was good. And then, of course, it must have been a special moment in Mike's life, Mike Mason's life, to be described as weird by Daryl Hannah. You would want to take that away, wouldn't you, and store it up as a special anecdotal moment where you got nailed as weird by Daryl Hannah. I mean, bloody hell. That's quite something. But we do all have a great deal in common here, we know that. And that's because we have a sense of tourism as a microcosm of the global economy as a whole, and as a critically important part of what we need to do to fashion a sustainable future. Just to put this in perspective very quickly for all of you in terms of the microcosm of the global economy, the growth and sustainability type arguments, in 2010 there were 940 million international arrivals. Somebody traveling from one country across borders to another country, 940 million. In the first 6 months of 2011, international tourism grew by 6.6%, so we are rapidly heading towards the 1 billion mark. 1 billion people traveling internationally from one country to the next, with all the attendant pluses and minuses, the balance sheet of tourism that we know and understand very well. People who come to an event like this, so all of you, live absolutely in the belly of this beast of an industry that continues to grow, that continues to impact on people's lives in a very dramatic way, that continues, of course, to affect the environment, both local and global. The point is, we live knowledgeably in the belly of this beast. There are very large numbers of people who live unknowingly in it. I have a very good colleague who is now so overwhelmingly conscious of what his responsibilities are when he travels internationally that he's developed the most sophisticated mechanism I have yet heard about to account for his responsibilities. And he calls it his CAMEO, his Carbon Mitigation Impact Offset. Now I want you all to focus on this just briefly this morning. Your carbon mitigation impact offset. So you have to think about 5 things. Firstly, what is the tonnage of CO2 that you've caused to be emitted into the atmosphere? Mike Mason, authority on high, tells me that by coming here to the Maldives, I have caused 4 tons of CO2 to be emitted to be here today. That's my first metric. Secondly, you have to take into account the gravity and seniority of the audience with whom you're spending the time. Thirdly, you have to think about the quality of your own speech on occasions such as this. So you're marking yourself then fairly harshly, I suggest, against a set of quality benchmarks. And lastly, you have to think about your effectiveness in lobbying and networking. So first you have your total tonnage, then you have to think about your audience, then you have to think about your own brilliance in delivering whatever it is that you're doing. And then he has, unfortunately, a rather important discount factor right at the end, which he calls his usual suspects discount factor. I.e., if you're talking to a bunch of the usual suspects, they're not going to do anything more than they're already doing anyway, so you probably didn't need to come in the first place. Unfortunately, we have quite a high usual suspects discount factor here, which means that all the speakers today are going to have to be even more bloody brilliant than they would have been otherwise to justify their presence here today. I joke a bit, but you all know that when we travel, we do have to embrace the responsibilities that come with them. We feel a deep sense of responsibility for this. I suspect that we are people who still feel very good about the power of travel and tourism, not just personally, but from a social, political, and cultural perspective. I'm very focused on this notion of tourism as a force for good in a world that seems to be increasingly troubled and unstable. Tourism as a force for good in terms of healing differences, bringing people together. It may sound a very frail and rather naive understanding of tourism, but remember the backdrop. Remember the backdrop. We still live in a world where governments, in their astonishing idiocy, commit somewhere around $1.4 trillion a year investing in weapons of war, either with the intent of using those weapons against others, or at least of building up some kind of defensive capability in the name of, quotes, national security, quotes. We live in a world where Western powers have spent $4 trillion conducting a war against terror over the last 10 years, as we were all reminded on the 10th anniversary of 9/11. $4 trillion, with the net effect of ensuring that those who are concerned about the global relationship between Christianity and Islam find themselves in a much more problematic position now than they were 10 years ago. We live in a world where internationalism itself is at risk, where fundamentalism is rampant, where aggressive nationalism is all over the place in one country after another, and where many countries who've taken a lead on these issues in the past suffer from a deep sense of exhaustion at having to provide leadership in such a troubled world. Now, against that backdrop, we'd better hang on to the idea of tourism as a force for good. Tourism as one of the few ways left to us to bridge the divides that the rest of the world seem only too happy to create and to make worse. So, that's my kind of opening gambit. Tourism has to be seen as a good thing, but we all know, because we wouldn't be here if we didn't know this, that tourism is its own worst enemy from a sustainability perspective. The overall balance sheet for tourism remains pretty grim. Most people in tourism are focused on quantity, not quality. Most tourism ministers, happily not here, but most tourism ministers are still focused almost exclusively on maximizing the value they can get out of the exploitable assets of their country. The majority of tourism businesses can't even be asked to play lip service to green issues, let alone actually do anything about them. So the backdrop is problematic, to say the least. And when we gather here in the Maldives, we are trying to think through the implications of coping with an industry as big as this, as brutish as this, in some ways, when you think about its impact on the rest of the world. Now, because we're here, it is natural to start thinking about small island states and the leadership that can be provided via those countries that feel most dangerously exposed to some of the consequences of irresponsible tourism. Small island states is a phrase that has much more resonance these days than it used to be. People understand that these are countries that are now at risk. And some years ago, as most of you will know, they constitutionally came together as a grouping of 39 different countries to increase their lobbying power at global conferences on climate change. And they have a huge moral cachet at these conferences as countries that are most dangerously exposed to the implications and the consequences of climate change. We'll hear a bit about that from Jean Ballandras from La Réunion later in this conference. Someone asked me to do a little bit of work looking at the small island states here in the Indian Ocean. The Maldives, Seychelles, Mauritius, and the Comoros. We extended that a bit to look at two other very big and important players in the tourism industry in the Indian Ocean, Sri Lanka and Madagascar. And just scanning through the impact of tourism and the contribution that tourism makes to those 6 countries, it's a really important picture that emerges. It is hugely important that those 6 countries find a way of being able to depend on tourism, but perhaps rather differently from the way they depend upon it today. So 4 very quick headline conclusions from this research. Lots of interest in ecotourism. and a huge amount of stuff on websites across the whole of the tourism industry in the Indian Ocean. Most of it is focused on marketing, most of it is wafer thin, and most of it has no credibility whatsoever. Focus on green tourism rather than sustainable tourism or ecotourism, and no real understanding about what sustainable tourism actually means, which I'll come back to in a moment. Focus from an environmental perspective on the local, not on the global, which is understandable, and a reluctance to engage in certain aspects of community or socio-economic implications of tourism today. Those are the four very simple headline conclusions. And I want to spend the rest of my comments now looking at that issue about the socio-economic dimension. We tend at gatherings like this to focus pretty much on the sustainability impacts seen through a green lens, rather than sustainability seen through a more holistic framework, embracing the totality of those socio-economic and cultural concerns. Now, in the 6 countries that we looked at here in the Indian Ocean, in each of those countries, equity gaps are widening. The gaps between the haves and the have-nots continue to get worse. And even as the tourism industry contributes more economically to the well-being of the citizens of those countries, because the gaps are building, you will not be surprised to know that resentment about the impact of the industry is rising at the same time. Especially in those countries where access to land, water, biomass, beachfronts, reefs, economic assets is being privileged to support the growth of the tourism industry rather than privileged to help the interests of local people. That won't surprise anybody here. But when we talk about the solutions agenda for sustainable tourism, we tend to put that to one side and focus on the slightly more familiar and comfortable territory of what we do on energy, on water, on waste, on biodiversity, on management of local assets, and perhaps pull back from the idea of addressing those socioeconomic challenges. Now, we can't really afford to do that. I described tourism at the start as a microcosm of the global economy. High-end luxury tourism is a microcosm of that microcosm. The finest resorts in the world, obviously, attract the world's wealthiest and most influential people, the elite, if you like, of the global economy today. No longer described as an aristocracy, of course, often described as a plutocracy, and by some pretty disaffected with the state of the economy today as a kleptocracy. A kleptocracy as in a tiny number of people, right in the apex of today's economy, essentially continuing to thrive and get richer and richer by stealing economic entitlements and assets from others further down in the pyramid. That's what people mean by a kleptocracy. It's a little bit uncomfortable, but the truth is that high-end luxury resorts attract quite a lot of people from those elites. So does that raise a particular challenge for us, a particular issue? Outside of our little bubble here in the Maldives right now, you can see how differently the world sees this elite. I'm sure, like me, you've been following the rather interesting story of Occupy Wall Street, this emergence in the middle of America of a large number of people who feel so profoundly disaffected at what's been happening since the financial crash in 2008 that they feel they have to express this now by taking to the streets or by taking their protest to the media, whatever it might be. Watch out for the symbolism of this. The surfacing of the really extraordinary fact that in the United States, 1% of the population of the United States controls more than 30% of the net wealth of the richest country in the world today. 1%, 30%. Lots of slogans now emerging saying, "We are the 99. We are the 99. Watch out for that, because none of us can possibly be insulated from that effect. And we need to be very careful when we talk about sustainable tourism, that we don't ignore that. So I was reading this, it's a very entertaining novel, by the way. It's a seriously good novel, and one of the characters in this novel runs a rather dodgy NGO that is trying to protect an endangered species by carving out a reserve in the coal belt in America. And this is the chief executive of this dodgy NGO explaining how he goes about this. Well, look, the real thing is, Walter said, that's the character, you see, the land is disappearing so fast that it's completely useless waiting for governments to do anything about it. Governments can't do conservation any longer. The problem with governments is they're elected by majorities that don't give a shit about biodiversity. Whereas billionaires, now billionaires are different. Billionaires do tend to care. They've got a stake in keeping the planet, not entirely rude F word, because they and their heirs are going to be the ones with enough money to enjoy the planet when the rest of us won't get any access to it at all. The reason my billionaire started doing conservation on his ranch in Texas was that he likes to hunt the big birds and then look at the small birds. Self-interest, sure, but a total win-win if you think about it from a conservation perspective. In terms of locking up habitat to save it from development, it's a lot easier to turn a few billionaires than to educate American voters who are perfectly happy with their cable, their Xboxes, their broadband, and their planet-trashing SUVs. So, I thought that's a little timely moment to think about the role of billionaires and the contribution that they could make to sustainable tourism in the world today. We have to do a lot more, seriously a lot more, about the social and economic aspects of what we mean by sustainable tourism. And I am a little bit preoccupied, I suppose, by the notion of lots of billionaires, not necessarily in our midst today, because obviously all you lot have taken the villas, so there's no room really for the normal billionaires. But thinking about it normally, how this place runs, it's a sort of fascinating challenge. What do you do when relatively significant numbers of the world's elite arrive in your midst in a resort like this with an opportunity to influence and to help them understand their responsibilities, and to do it creatively, humorously, impactfully, lastingly, in such a way that they go away thinking this is an agenda of which they can be an important part. And that isn't easy. And I really do take my hats off to what Sonu and Eva are trying to do in this regard, is to allow people to think about responsibilities in a different way. I don't want to make light of this, because this is a difficult moment in the history of humankind. This 1%, this elite, find it incredibly easy to insulate themselves from the real world. After all, think briefly about the kind of lives that they lead as they move effortlessly from high security offices to their gated communities to their privileged luxury holiday resorts. They live in a bubble. The real world rarely penetrates into that bubble, and it becomes harder and harder to persuade them that they are now massively implicated in the unsustainability in the economic model that we have today. It would be, I'm sure you all agree, terrible if in some respect resorts became an exacerbating factor in that insulation. So they'd move from high security office to gated community to gated luxury resort, with even fewer opportunities for the real world to break in on their insulated lives. So focusing on this issue about equity, about share of the gain from tourism today, is for me just as important as focusing on the carbon implications. Just think yesterday to the talks that we had about wastewater and energy, and this very passionate appeal from Edward Norton and Michael Walker about the power of distributed technologies to bring benefits to small island states, to communities, to societies as a whole. This is an incredible revolution emerging in our midst. We can now begin to think about distributed energy solutions, distributed water and waste solutions, distributed solutions regarding access to land, biomass, agriculture. We're no longer dependent on centralized, top-down, grid-based answers to everything we need to do. But wouldn't it be peculiar in that world of amazing distributed technological possibility if we just ignored the issue of distributing the wealth that flows from it? There are plenty of talks over the next 2 days looking again at the power of distribution and distributed technology benefits. Let's just keep in mind that as we do that, we have to think about the distribution that flows from the use of those technologies. Otherwise, as you all know, we could become implicated in an own goal of mega proportions. Very low carbon, very high inequality. That is not the judgment that any of us would feel comfortable with in 5 years' time. So my last thought to you about this is not just do we need Cameo, which is the carbon impact mitigation story I was talking about, but INEO as well, which is an inequality impact offset tool, so that we think about what we're doing from the perspective of social justice as much as what we're doing from the perspective of low carbon. Thank you.